Hey everyone, I'm Rick Doherty, host of Tall Guy Talks Travel, joined again by my good friend and co-host Maz. Maz, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, we are going to talk about something big now, and we took a little bit of time after this news was announced to ruminate on it, and we are finally ready to talk about the big announcement from back in January that Kathleen Kennedy was going to be stepping down as the head of Lucasfilm, turning things over to Dave Filoni. I think, first of all, that was a very popular decision for a certain segment of the Star Wars fandom. But first of all, let's just talk about your initial reaction to the announcement that Kathleen Kennedy was stepping down from Lucasfilm.
Yeah, I feel like I wasn't super surprised as there have been, rumblings and rumors and whisperings of it happening for a while now. Um, and I think, I'm hesitant to say right now w whether it's a good or a bad thing. Um, I certainly have hope in the future of the brand as a fan of the brand, like I want it to succeed. But I think it's hard to say right now whether that's going to be a positive or negative impact overall.
And we have talked a lot about Bob Iger and some of his decisions and some of the, let's say, weaknesses he brings in that he is very, very willing and almost eager to basically just follow whatever they're saying about him online and whatever they're saying about the company online. And he doesn't really have a huge backbone. And we're never going to know what the behind the scenes conversations were like. But I'm wondering if now that Bob Iger's tenure is coming to an end as well, if this was something that he sort of wanted to get done before he left, and maybe this wasn't as much of a resignation as it sounds in writing.
Yeah, I think it certainly seems that way. It's a little bit of, the writing on the wall behind the scenes. It feels a little bit like there have been some conflicts behind the scenes between certain leadership roles. And this was kind of the end result, whether it was, Kathleen Kennedy saying, "This is it, I'm done, I'm moving on," or if it was kind of a conversation between them where they realized that was the best move.
Starting in 1977, Star Wars was a movie. And we are going to talk about television shows and we're going to talk about theme park lands and we are going to talk about a lot of these different avenues and a lot of these different aspects of this decision. But the first thing we're going to have to talk about, and I think the thing that is the most important to focus on in this conversation, is Kathleen Kennedy and how she looked over the Star Wars brand of movies.
Hmm.
So let's just start with the sequel trilogy. And then we're going to move on to an area where I think you're going to be a little more pro Kathleen Kennedy. But we're going to start with the sequel trilogy because this was the big thing. The Force Awakens comes out and it is billed as the return of Star Wars. And the prequels had gotten so much hate and Disney was taking over the brand that they absolutely needed a big, big hit with that very first Star Wars movie out of the gate. And I think The Force Awakens overall delivered on what was needed.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a huge hit. It did a great job of blending the nostalgia to get the series back off the ground with bringing in new characters and new ideas and stories. Um, Hugely popular, widely loved, and overall massively a success. I think it was out of the gate made us all feel very hopeful.
And there are going to be some times during this conversation where I talk about individual moments in these movies. And I think right off the bat with The Force Awakens, they just nailed it. They had that scene where the stormtroopers were rattling as they were in this vehicle ready to go. You don't even know where they're going, right? But you see the new version of the stormtroopers and they're getting ready to attack. And then when you finally see Kylo Ren, this new villain that is going to be taking over after the most iconic villain in the history of fiction. And it was just such a brilliant scene. You can say a lot of bad things about Kathleen Kennedy, and we might not. But one of the things about these movies is they were shot incredibly well and had some iconic scenes. And I think that's the first one that I want to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. Like when you think about the original trilogy of Star Wars, there are, of course, iconic moments that come to mind for everyone. And I feel like this did a great job in rebooting that, in, you know, bringing new iconic moments to mind and to our screens without feeling like it was only playing off the past or only doing it because of the past. And like, yes, The Force Awakens has a lot of similarities to New Hope, but I think in a way that was necessary at the time.
I mean, you can't reboot this franchise. I know it's part of the same story, but it was a little bit of a reboot here. And you can't do that without having some of the things that remind people why they love it in the first place. There are reasons that things become cliches, right? Like it's because
Exactly.
they stand up and they work, and formulas exist because people like the formula. I don't have to tell you, you like Hallmark Christmas movies.
Exactly. Look, give me a formula, I'm happy.
So I think that was a good thing, and it did help to not have the story overwhelm the new characters. So if you had this real intricate new universe, I know a lot of people complain that they didn't explain a lot of what was going on with how the First Order took over after everything that happened in the original trilogy and all that stuff. But I think if you spent too much time with that, people are like, oh, wait, hold on. I have to pay attention to the politics. Now I have to pay attention to these new characters. Kind of a problem that they actually had in The Phantom Menace was that they were trying to explain too much plot while introducing you to characters like Qui-Gon Jinn and Darth Maul, characters that you hadn't seen before, and they were trying to have this elaborate story. So instead, you simplify the story, have that be something very familiar. Then you can say, here's Rey, here's Finn, here's Poe. These are different characters. They seem kind of similar. There are similarities between them and some of the past characters, but we're not going to overwhelm you with story so that we can get you to understand who these individuals are as characters.
Exactly. And it's a really, really smart move because, like you said, there have been times where Star Wars has gotten in its own way, trying to get bogged down with, almost over explaining things. And at the end of the day, this is, a fantasy sci-fi movie series. We don't necessarily need to know the ins and outs between every single thing to buy into the fact that bad people have gotten control and that needs to be stopped. Like that as a formula is iconic. It is, as old as time and There are a million ways you could fill it in yourself, or they could go back and fill it in if they really wanted to. But I don't feel like it's something that an audience really needs to get into the nitty-gritty on in order to believe the story.
Well, and I think that we'll get to the TV shows and everything like that and what's coming up in the future in a little bit. But The Mandalorian takes place in that time period in between the original trilogy and the start of the sequel trilogy. And we still don't know everything that's going to be happening with The Mandalorian. The Mandalorian and Grogu movie is going to be coming out at some point here. And I think because that's in that time frame, we might actually start to get some of those explanations. They might start to give us some of that, which was good because you introduce us to the characters. We don't have to know all that backstory. Then you introduce us to two new characters, the Mandalorian and Grogu. And now through their story, you can just have some of that stuff happening in the background, which is better than just overrunning with exposition in the very first movie out of the gate.
Yes. And if you're Disney and you have a streaming platform, it is a very smart business move to say, we're going to give you the big story on the screen in the trilogy that you need to know. And then, hey, if you want to get into the weeds and learn about all these details and these things that took place in between the movies, subscribe to our streaming platform and you can get all of that information.
We have talked a lot about Star Wars over the past 5 years that we've had this podcast, but we never really got into the characters that we were introduced to in the sequel trilogy. So I just want to talk about them for a little bit. First of all, obviously, Rey is the stand in for Luke Skywalker, desert planet, great at everything without really knowing exactly why. What do you think about Ray? And of course, we're never going to be able to escape having the conversation about, is she a quote unquote Mary Sue? What are your thoughts about her as a character?
Oh, I think she's a great character. I think, look, Star Wars as a series has been held up by the idea that you're going to have the hero character, the archetype of the hero. And this character is someone who is, is great at everything. And it's kind of mysterious why they're so good at everything, but they really are good at everything they do. And then Star Wars doubled down on that in the prequel series and said, well, there's midi-chlorians. And then that's why some people have like all these talents. So I feel like within the world that Star Wars themselves has created, you cannot get upset about Rey being successful at what she does, especially because she has, like you said, she is essentially the Luke of this series, and she has a very similar journey to him. She does still train, she does still work, but she has a natural talent and a natural ability, and you need that. You need that to drive your story forward.
I love when a movie franchise, and I think of Rocky sometimes when I think of this, and how in Rocky 5, which absolutely bombed, at least by Rocky standards, he has brain damage and he can't fight. If he takes one more punch, he's gonna die. And they go through all of this in Rocky 5, and then Rocky 5 doesn't do well. And then they finally, years and years and years later, do Rocky Balboa, which is essentially Rocky 6. And no, like, forget that that ever happened. And I kind of feel like that's the Metachlorians. Like,
Hmm.
they never talk about them again because it just had such an awful response by people. I don't think everybody wants to know why these people are special. I think they want that to be something that is part of the mystery. And sometimes people just have different talents. And in a universe like Star Wars where there is a semblance of magic, I don't think we have to explain everything in that way. And I also think there's something to the fact that there's a reason why we're telling these people's stories. If they were just regular people, they wouldn't be in a sci-fi movie. Like sci-fi movies, especially in the vein of Star Wars, you're necessarily dealing with people who are exceptional, who have talents that maybe you can't explain. That's why you have movies that aren't just biographies about regular people. It's because they have these talents and you want to see what somebody like that is going to do and how they will react. And I don't think there was anything wrong with having Ray have these remarkable abilities, even though I think it was very much exaggerated by people who didn't like these movies,
Yes.
how much that she was special. But Luke was, and Anakin was. That was the whole point of the six previous movies, that there were these people who just had a special ability. Yes, there was Han, who was a regular person who didn't have special abilities, but he was also really cool and he was a great pilot, but he learned how to be a great pilot. And one of the things about the original trilogy was seeing those people interact and how Luke had to learn from somebody who maybe didn't necessarily have the Force. And then he had to learn from somebody who did in Yoda. Like all of these different things were part of the reason that you tell these movies. And I
Yes.
think that got lost by a lot of people who complain on the internet. Now let's move on to Finn, because this was a really unique idea. Make the stormtroopers seem like people. Show that behind every one of those masks is an actual human being, somebody with emotions, somebody who doesn't want to be there, somebody who has been held captive for some reason. And I think that was a really strong thing to introduce to the franchise.
Yeah, I love the concept of his character. I think that Finn's character is probably the most intriguing of the new three. It brings you an angle that we really haven't seen before. And I personally think that his character is where they drop the ball the most in terms of delivering on the setup there. But I think it's a really cool angle to see someone have to kind of deconstruct how they see the world and kind of be thrown into this. And yeah, I do wish we could have gotten a little more from him.
I think one of the things that's really funny about how they present all this is you finally see Finn's face, and all of a sudden, everybody in the theater is just thinking, oh my goodness, like there's a person behind every one of these stormtroopers. And now we're seeing one of their faces. And this is incredible. They have thoughts, they have emotions. And then almost immediately, a ton of stormtroopers just get mowed down.
Yep.
It's like, we're going to make you care about them and then immediately kill a whole bunch of them. So now let's move on to the third of the main three, and that would be Poe. I think Poe is obviously the closest stand in to Han Solo in this. He is the great pilot. He is arrogant. He's good looking as all get out. And they have him as that stand in for Han Solo. But they really play Poe very, very well.
Yes. I mean, come on. Who doesn't love Poe's character? He's great. Um, he's so much fun as, a Han fan. I like seeing that kind of character come back with the swagger and a little cockiness and, but also the skills to back it up. It's not like he's arrogant for no reason. He is actually very skilled at what he does and he knows it. And that's always fun to bring into a team dynamic. I think it gives you a lot of good team arguments.
It's the easiest character to make likable, right? The guy who is so good, or gal, who is so good at whatever they're doing that they can have that arrogance and you can't really do anything about it. I mean, we'll get into that a little bit in the next movie, but because they have that confidence and because you need them and their skill, you just sort of have to let them, be arrogant because you need them so much. And that is such a great character archetype. Now, before we move on to any of the other aspects of this movie, they hint very, very heavily in this movie that Finn and Poe might end up in a relationship. Now, just watching The Force Awakens, do you think that was the original direction they were going to go with this, but then they chickened out on it? Or do you think they were just giving themselves the option of going in that direction if they felt it was a good idea?
They were giving themselves the option. I am not willing to give them more credit necessarily than they're due, especially like under the Disney brand as a whole. They have a penchant of saying like, "Oh my God, look, Disney, we're making a movie and it's the first gay character and look at us, we're great." And it's a character that has like one line in a scene and you're like, "Really? That's what all this was about?" So I don't think that they were necessarily saying, "Yes, we're going to like go in this direction." I think it was a little a an option for them. I think they were like, "Well, we'll put it out there. We'll see what the reception is. We'll see how we want to play this down the line." And B, whether intended or not, it was a little bit of that good old-fashioned queer baiting of we're going to put this out there, let the fandom go wild. It's going to stoke conversation. It's going to, have people shipping them and doing this and that, and it's going to create buzz. And that buzz is going to be good for us. So I don't think they necessarily intended to go that route all in.
And then in the third movie of the trilogy, we can throw in 3 seconds where Poe looks at a woman and gives a hey, no homo look at her. And they can
And that
completely
it's all
reverse.
okay.
And then, boom, presto changeo, straight character. The last 5 minutes of Rise of Skywalker. But anyway, I think another aspect of this is The Force Awakens came out in late 2015. So they can introduce this will they, won't they with two male characters and then say, hey, the United States is going to tell us in a couple months how they feel about this kind of stuff. And we can make the decision if we want to continue to move in that direction or if we want to change course. And obviously, we know what ended up happening. And that might have been part of that decision making process for Disney and Lucasfilm. But we've got to move on now and talk about the next movie, the most controversial film in the sequel trilogy, my favorite Star Wars movie of all time, a Star Wars movie I think you like, one that has one of the coolest looking scenes, if we're talking about great cinematography in the history of movies, The Last Jedi. So, just some initial thoughts on The Last Jedi before we really delve into this.
It's my personal favorite of this trilogy. I think it does a great job. I think Force Awakens sets you up, plays on the nostalgia, gives you familiarity, and then this one takes it and brings it into a new direction, which is what you want from a new trilogy. You don't want to tell the exact same story. You can pull on similar thoughts and ideas and themes, but ultimately, if you're creating something new, you want to create something new. And this does a great job of taking the story we love and the characters we love and bringing them into this new world because time has gone by. Things have changed, things are different, and bringing really a new life into the Star Wars brand. Now, apparently, a lot of people don't like any sort of change, and it got a bit lambasted. But for me, I thought it was a very positive decision, and it was something that is the right decision. It's a creative risk, and I thought for me personally, it paid off.
Well, Maz, you have to remember that there was a lady with pink hair and an Asian woman, so they had to
Terrible.
really, yeah, that's not acceptable to a lot of these people.
In Star
And
Wars?
I
What?
know. It's a fandom that has never been problematic at all for a minute.
Mm-mm.
But there are a lot of things that I love about this movie, and one of them is the kids. And they introduced this thought almost of fans, like people who grow up wanting to be part of the resistance. And that's something that they didn't even delve into in the original trilogy. And I think that's something very important, that what they're doing, this fight against the First Order, is gaining support. It's something that actually should have been built upon better in The Rise of Skywalker, because that just had all of a sudden everybody shows up and is ready to save the day, when this was sort of building up to something happening in The Rise of Skywalker. We do have to address the elephant in the room, and that is The Force Awakens ends with Rey handing the lightsaber to Luke Skywalker, and then The Last Jedi starts with Luke Skywalker throwing it over his shoulder. Now, I am going to argue there is nowhere they could have gone with that, because J.J. Abrams, who directed the first movie, gave them nowhere to go. Why couldn't they find Luke Skywalker unless he didn't want to be found? Everybody wanted it to seem like it was some sort of weird exile, but they would have been able to find him if he wanted them to find him. He's got the Force. He shows up using the Force later in this movie. If he wanted to be found, he would be found. So it's obvious, and it was obvious to Rian Johnson when he started making this movie. Well, obviously, Luke wants to be in exile, so he doesn't want to be fighting this fight right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole point. And I think that this is something that actually, to bring it back, falls on Kathleen Kennedy's shoulders because it is something where she, in this position has not sat and considered what the trilogy will look like as a whole. And yeah, hey, they got away with it for the original trilogy. They got away with it kind of at times for the prequel trilogy. But the prequel trilogy experience should have let them know that, hey, you kind of got to go into this with some sort of overarching mentality of what this is going to look like. And that is the prime example of, J.J. Abrams having so much creative control that he was able to kind of write them into this corner where then Rian Johnson had to go, well, no, that doesn't make sense. This is how you have to handle this because yeah, he's in exile for a reason. Otherwise, yeah, why can't you find him? There's something behind that. There is a purpose behind that. And then you have people getting mad at Ryan Johnson and saying, well, why would you do that? You changed Luke. And it's like, well, first of all, it's not that much of a stretch to think of Luke becoming this character. I don't think that's, this unlikely thing. Think of all he's been through, everything he's worked for, all like the trauma he's gone through at such a young age. It is not unrealistic to think that maybe he's, a bit of a grouch and wants some peace for once in his life. That's, hey, I get it. I have days where I'm like, I'm gonna go live in a cave. Forget it. So it's interesting to me that there was none of this discussion happening, seemingly, before those were being written.
I agree with you 100% there. I just want to say a couple quick things about The Last Jedi before we change course once again here. The scene in the Red Room when Kylo Ren and Rey join forces very briefly. And of course, Kylo Ren kills Snoke, which ends up creating a problem because they didn't map it out properly in the third movie. But anyway, and for a quick moment, they come together, and that scene is just absolute chef's kiss. Like, I don't think there has been a better filmed scene in Star Wars than that one right there. It took all of the technology at the time and just created something absolutely beautiful. I also want to say that one thing that gets heavily criticized about this movie is Finn and Rose and their sort of side quest.
Hmm.
But I do think that showing that there are people who have no moral compass, who are profiting from this never ending battle between whether it's the Empire and the First Order or the Rebellion, that there are people who, we think of Darth Vader and Kylo Ren as being the villains. But at least it's like in The Big Lebowski. Say what you will about the tenets of National Socialism, but at least it's an ethos, right? Like, at least they believe something. And these other people are just making money off of the constant battle, off of the quote unquote Star Wars. It's not called Star War, right? So that was something that I thought was important to address, and it gave them the ability to show those youngsters who were looking up to the resistance and were going to be that next generation. And as we talk about a Rey movie in the future, she's got to train somebody, right? So maybe.
Yeah, and going off that, The Last Jedi has one of my favorite scenes in Star Wars, with the kid with the broom at the end when he pulls the broom to him and he's looking up at the stars. And I think that's just such a beautiful encapsulation of the Star Wars universe. There are all these hugely remote planets. Everything's, spread out, and it doesn't matter who you are. You could have these abilities, you could have these talents. This kid was a stable boy. He wasn't a Skywalker. He wasn't anyone important, quote unquote. But he did have these abilities and these talents. And I think that's just such a perfect, soul to these movies.
And it says it doesn't matter who your parents are, it doesn't matter who your grandparents are. You can do something special. That was the main point of this movie, The Last Jedi. That, yes, Luke was Anakin Skywalker's son, but Anakin Skywalker just came from a mother who was a slave. Yes, we found out later that it was a little more special than that. And then We find out Luke Skywalker has these incredible abilities, and then we find out why later. They didn't have to retcon it like they did with Rey. They could have let somebody come from a different angle. But Ryan Johnson got a lot of crap for The Last Jedi. And Kathleen Kennedy, Bob Iger, and everybody at Lucasfilms said, "Oh my God, we have to save this franchise. We spent $4 billion on it." So what they did was they said, The Force Awakens seemed to work. Let's go back to J.J. Abrams.
Exactly.
So we're just going to move right into it now. After The Last Jedi, Kathleen Kennedy goes back to the well and brings back J.J. Abrams, who directed The Force Awakens. And they come up with The Rise of Skywalker. Now, the big thing that we have been saying this whole time is the problem with the sequel trilogy is not that Rey is a Mary Sue. It's not that they don't develop Finn enough, although that is a little bit of a problem. The main problem with the sequel trilogy is that they didn't have a plan. And they made it through The Force Awakens, and they made it kind of through The Last Jedi. I mean, a lot of people got mad, but I don't think that's their fault. But then they panicked, and The Rise of Skywalker was a hot mess. Maz, go.
Yeah, it's one of those like as a fan, incredibly frustrating to see the creatives say, "Yeah, we we don't know what we're doing. Let's let the horde of angry fans control the narrative for this timeless piece of media that everyone's going to have forever." That's never a good way to make decisions. I felt like it was very much a rash decision, very much a panic decision, and that came from a place of fear instead of a place of, calm, cool, collected, what's actually best for this franchise. And that's incredibly frustrating. And it's, you have as a fan, I remember when the prequel trilogy came out, and I remember mixed emotions. Now, I was a kid when that trilogy came out, so like I liked Phantom Menace. I didn't know any better. That was like a big nostalgia moment for me, right? Like it was just fun to see pod racing. I was easy to please as a kid. But, you watch those again as you get older and you're like, "Man, I really want like a do-over." And then they're like, "Oh, actually, we're giving you that. We're doing a sequel trilogy." And you're like, "Oh my God, okay, they can learn from all the mistakes. They can learn from the past. We're going to get a sequel trilogy. It's going to be great." And then you have a good Force Awakens, a great second movie, and then the last movie absolutely nosedives. And it's like it walks back everything from the previous movie. And it's incredibly frustrating as a fan. It's incredibly frustrating as someone who works in a creative field to see them basically give a vote of no confidence to creative decisions that they had previously approved. And I wish we had a better ending. I wish we had a better ending.
We had an episode at the end of last year, I believe, where we talked about Disney's billion-dollar busts. And these were movies that were absolutely huge at the box office, but had no cultural relevance. And every problem that we mentioned in that episode is basically personified by The Rise of Skywalker. We have talked recently a lot about the problems from Bob Iger's leadership of the Walt Disney Company, especially his second term. And The Rise of Skywalker is everything that is wrong with Bob Iger's second term at Disney, even though it happened in his first term at Disney. Bob Iger, and I think his thumb being on the scale at Lucasfilms. I think Kathleen Kennedy kind of had to go along with this. I don't think she necessarily would have made these decisions, but with Bob Iger's thumb on the scale saying, we spent $4 billion on this franchise and you're blowing it with guys who live in their mom's basement because they're doing podcasts. I know I'm hypocritical on the podcast thing, but because they're doing podcasts and they're writing blogs and they're tweeting that they don't like this sequel trilogy and you need to fix it. So everything they're saying is wrong with the first two movies. You have to fix in the first half hour of The Rise of Skywalker. And they only made it worse. Because guess what? The neckbeards, they're not going to like it no matter what. They didn't like The Rise of Skywalker. And then you took the people who did enjoy The Last Jedi and you turned them away. So it was almost like by trying to please everybody, they made the worst possible movie.
Well, and something that I find really interesting, I had to look this up. So The Force Awakens has on Rotten Tomatoes an 84% from audience. So good rating, especially if you're coming back to like a fan series. That's a big deal. The Last Jedi has a 41% rating, which is not surprising considering all the controversy surrounding it. So then, they go back, they reverse course, they do all these things. But then Rise of Skywalker only has a 51% rating. Still terrible. So, like you said, they did all this and they really didn't gain any ground. No one really cared.
And I think one of the things that people like us, I mean, I don't know if, well, especially you, I don't know if you're chronically online, but I'm pretty chronically online. So I saw all of the conversations about The Last Jedi and I knew about the quote unquote controversies, but the average fan didn't. And when I say fan, I mean somebody who's like, oh, there's a new Star Wars movie, let's go. I think the people who are going to go on Rotten Tomatoes and review it are necessarily going to be the ones who have just a huge thought about it, a big, just not going to be able to change their mind opinion about the movie. That's when they're going to fill out a review on Rotten Tomatoes. Not if they went and saw it and they were like, oh, that was fun. And then they went out to dinner and then they lived their lives like normal human beings. Disney was trying to please such a small segment of the fan base. It was just a loud segment. And that was the problem. Because if they would have just stayed in that direction, it wasn't that only 41% of Star Wars fans liked The Last Jedi. It was of the people who took the time to go on Rotten Tomatoes, only 41% of them liked it. And the backlash was not what you were seeing in the real world.
Yeah. And I also think it's interesting that The Last Jedi grossed more than Rise of Skywalker. It's not a huge disparity, but it is a disparity. And I think it's interesting that, for whatever reason, either people turned out for The Last Jedi and then were like, nah, I'm done with this franchise and didn't go see Rise of Skywalker. So all those people you're trying to please didn't show up anyway. Or people went to see The Last Jedi multiple times and didn't do that with Rise of Skywalker. It's who knows, really. But I do think it's interesting that they did make all these panic moves and then ended up making less at the box office.
One of the things that I always say about The Rise of Skywalker is when I left the theater, I was like, man, that was fun. Like, that was good. And it was visually, once again, stunning. There were some amazing visual scenes. But then when I thought about it a little more, I was like, that wasn't it wasn't a thing. It wasn't anything. It's the cotton candy of Star Wars movies. You eat it and it tastes good, but you're still hungry. Like you have nothing substantial, no nutrition in your belly. You just if you sprayed water on it, it just disappears, right? And I think that was the problem with the Rise of Skywalker. By trying to be everything to everyone, it was nothing to anybody. And it had some great scenes. It had some fun moments. We got to see Billy D. Williams again. That's cool. And oh, Chewbacca died. No, he didn't. Psych. It was just weird and crazy. And it was almost the exact opposite of The Force Awakens. When we say The Force Awakens, they were developing these characters and they were giving you character moments, and the story wasn't going to distract. And then in The Rise of Skywalker, it was like, can we just have so much stuff happening that people don't notice that we didn't write an ending to this thing? So I think that because Kathleen Kennedy didn't sit down with everybody and say, this is how we're going to chart these movies, it ended up being a really big problem. Now, the only thing I could think is maybe she did, but they panicked after The Last Jedi and they just said, we're bringing in JJ and we're just going to let him do whatever he wants.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately we'll never know because sadly we weren't in those rooms for those conversations as much as I wish we could have been. Um, but we can guess, and I think that Kathleen Kennedy has a track record of kind of changing course mid-movie regardless, sometimes for good, sometimes potentially for bad. So it wouldn't surprise me if she was part of that decision. But then, Bob Iger, who we've talked about before, also doesn't have that much of a backbone. So it wouldn't surprise me if he also was like, no, we really need to make everyone happy. And I don't care what you say, this is what we have to do. Um, so it's just interesting choices.
And we ended up getting a movie that really did put a stop to the momentum that had been building for Star Wars. Now, one of the reasons that the momentum was building for Star Wars was because they started doing something a little different. They started releasing movies that weren't a part of the Skywalker saga. And the first one of those was Rogue One. This is Maz's favorite Star Wars movie. I think if you ask the majority of people, even if they don't like the sequel trilogy and they hate everything about Disney Star Wars, they're usually okay with Rogue One. And we've talked about this a little bit how one of the complaints was, oh, well, Rey is a Mary Sue. She had all this power. She wasn't a regular person and blah, 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 all that stuff. Well, Rogue One is just a bunch of regular people for the most part. It is regular people. They're not force sensitive. They are fighting as part of the resistance, but their dad wasn't Darth Vader. They're not a part of it in that way. I know you love this movie, so talk about everything they got right with Rogue One.
Okay, well, first of all, we don't have the time for that. So, that'll be 4 hours of me rambling, and I won't do that to you. But I think you touched on a lot of it already. It's a story about regular people. It's something that Star Wars fans have wanted for a while. You have this entire universe that they've built out, and we've only seen such a small, tiny slice of it. And Rogue One really gave us a bigger picture of the people who are living in this world day to day and, how the resistance is really fighting. Because, the Jedi are great. but they're a really, really, really tiny percentage of people who are fighting here. Like, let's face it, there's not many of them. That's the whole point. So the resistance as a whole is made up of these regular people who are sacrificing their lives, who are giving everything they have to try to fight this tyranny. And I think that, you know, getting that look at these people is so special. And you do feel a connection to them because you're watching it and you're like, oh, I'm also a regular person. You know, you're not watching someone who's magic. You're watching people who are down on their luck, who are, you know, in a weird situation. They did such a great job of bringing humanity to all of these characters. But then, you know, it's dire straits. There's obviously super high stakes here. It's also a really funny movie. They did a great job bringing in elements of humor. You know, you have K2SO, who is hilarious and sassy and a great little droid sidekick. Well, not little, but he brings enough humor to the movie that it feels light. You don't feel depressed by it, mostly. You know, it's just, it is a really, really good movie. And it's something that the story of the little people fighting to overthrow the big guy is such a popular thing. And it's something that, like you said, even if you're not a fan of Star Wars, I know people who hate Star Wars, who love Rogue One, and like will be like, oh, I watched Rogue One again. Oh, I feel like watching it again. And they've, you know, never watched a sequel trilogy film because they just don't care. So it has a really broad appeal, and I think that helps a lot too.
I make a correlation between the celebrations for the 250th anniversary of the United States, which is happening this year, and we're seeing a lot of stuff. There was a Ken Burns documentary. People are having their own different commemorations for it. And one of the things that drives me crazy is you know what we all know about George Washington, and we know about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Benedict Arnold, and now we even know about Alexander Hamilton if you didn't know about him before. But what we don't talk enough about in the history of the country is the coal miners, the people who laid the track and the railroad, the slaves. We don't talk about these people who were regular people who made a huge difference and a huge impact on the United States. And it's not just presidents, it's not just generals, it's not just pillars of business. It's regular people who have the impact and make the biggest impact on the country when we're talking about the 250th anniversary. And in Star Wars, it is also the same types of people. And that is what Rogue One got right. And they also took the greatest villain of all time, Darth Vader, and they were like, can we possibly make him even cooler?
Yep.
And they did
That's
it.
They crushed it. That's again one of, you know, like we are talking about our favorite Star Wars scenes. And like that's absolutely one of them for me. Like he is so evil, but he looks so cool.
Absolutely. And that's always been the big thing about Darth Vader, but they really nailed it in Rogue One. I'm not even going to take a lot of time to talk about Solo, a Star Wars story. This was a fine little movie, but I don't think they did what they were trying to do with it. I think a combination of the backlash to The Last Jedi led to some of the neckbeards not going to the theaters. And I think that, you know, Harrison Ford is Han Solo. And as great of a job as they did in this movie, and some of it was really, really good, and some of it was really, really enjoyable. But I'm just not going to watch a Han Solo movie that doesn't have Harrison Ford. And Harrison Ford hates Star Wars so much that that's never going to happen again. So we're just going to sort of
Yeah,
breeze past Solo. It was a nice attempt, but I don't think that that was really what they were trying to accomplish.
I agree. I do think it's interesting that it's one of those where the director was changed mid-production. So, we'll never know what the original vision for Solo was because that kind of got scrapped in the middle of it. Whether that ended up making it better or worse, unfortunately, we won't know. But I do think it's important because it does speak back to, behind the scene tension, creative confusion, maybe a battle for creative control that, plays out on a much bigger way in the Star Wars trilogy.
Yeah, and for some reason they said who should direct a Star Wars movie, and they went with Ron Howard, which Ron Howard has many talents. I just don't really picture him as a guy directing Star Wars movies. But I want to take the remaining time we have here and I want to focus on two things. I want to focus on the television shows on Disney Plus, and I want to get into the theme parks because this is a travel show after all. So
Yeah.
when we talk about the television shows, they have a huge success right out of the gate with The Mandalorian. Baby Yoda becomes a cultural phenomenon, that cultural impact that they didn't have in the sequel trilogy movies, that they certainly didn't have with The Rise of Skywalker, but they found it with The Mandalorian and Baby Yoda. And this was another sort of regular people story because it's revolving around regular people. And then there's this one force sensitive baby that's, living around these people. So it is more of the real world of Star Wars.
Yeah, I mean, it was a smash hit. It was everywhere. It was, gosh, Baby Yoda, I mean, took over in a way that, like, truly I hadn't seen since Elsa, which is a crazy comparison to draw, but that's what it felt like. There was a time when you couldn't turn around in a store without seeing an Elsa doll or hearing Let It Go. And that's what it felt like with The Mandalorian. Baby Grogu was everywhere and was like the thing. And I think that that's really interesting because it was such a big success right out of the gate. It really propelled them to just keep going. And I think that that may not have been the best choice at quite such a rapid speed. But yeah, I mean, it's undeniable that that was massively successful.
And then let's talk a little bit about the other shows, the ones that weren't quite as successful, but I know that you love Andor. This is continuing the story from Rogue One. I think the Disney Plus format, and you do have to give Kathleen Kennedy credit for this, is a great way to tell some of these smaller stories that don't have to make $1 billion, and they can make them a little more affordably, and they can tell good stories that Star Wars fans will watch and maybe don't have to be as big as Stranger Things or the gay hockey show or whatever. They can just be these nice little compact stories that they put on Disney Plus.
Yeah, and I think, The Mandalorian and Andor, I would say, are their two most successful shows. I think that both of those had a very positive reception, had a very, you know, large audience. And I think Andor specifically has reached a lot of people in its relevant themes, we'll say. Um, I think a lot of people relate to some of those themes in Andor. Now, all their other shows, I've enjoyed a lot of them, but like things like Obi-Wan, you know, It's one of those did we really need it kind of things. I I did really enjoy it. I can't lie. But it's not like it was super successful, kind of forgettable. Honestly, I couldn't tell you everything that happens in it. And I think that, Disney as a whole, and I feel like this is the Disney strategy. It's not so much Kathleen Kennedy. Their new strategy became we have this platform, we're going to tell every possible story. Instead of saying, what stories do we need to tell that benefit from this format? It became, we're going to tell everything we possibly can. And we saw that with Marvel, and then we saw it with Star Wars. And I think at some point, it begins to fatigue even the biggest fans.
Yeah, there is only so much content you can consume, right? And I don't think Disney has gotten to that level yet, but Star Wars, for all of the major fandom and all the jokes about the crazy Star Wars fans, is a franchise that appeals to regular people. And it was made famous by high school kids in the 70s who were just like, whoa, what's this? And a few of them, a small segment, got really, really into it. But most people who like Star Wars are just like, oh, there's a new Star Wars movie, let's go. And I don't think they're gravitating to the shows on Disney Plus quite as much as that small segment who just really, really loves it. Now, that small segment might be enough to sustain Disney Plus shows, but they're going to have to get back into the rhythm of releasing movies if they're going to make their $4 billion investment worth it. And one of the other areas where that $4 billion investment was expected to pay huge dividends, and frankly, I don't think it's doing quite as well as they wanted, was in the theme parks and Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. When this thing opened, I think you and I, like, we were both on board with this thing, right? And we loved it. But you're starting now to see some of the changes. So, Harry Potter, that opened at Universal, and everybody was like, oh, immersion and a story. We want to be put inside this story and we want to live it and we want incredible theming and we want to feel like we're there. So Disney was like, okay, well, that's what we have to do now with Star Wars. And Galaxy's Edge has to feel like you're actually in Star Wars. Well, they don't play music when you're just walking around an alien planet. So no music. We're not going to do music in Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. And this has to be a very, very specific timeline. So we can't have Han Solo there. We can't have Luke Skywalker there. It's got to be Kylo Ren and Stormtroopers and Rey. And we'll create a character that nobody knows, which was cool. But it's not going to bring anybody, to the party. Now, at least at Disneyland, they're starting to pop a little music in here and there. They're starting to have Leia be a part of the meet and greets, or not the meet and greets, but the character interactions. We've already seen the Mandalorian and Grogu appear on both coasts as part of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. So they're starting to take the timeline and some of this. They're even doing a really long refurbishment on Oga's Cantina, which makes me think, I wonder if that's going to be different when it reopens from that refurbishment. Do you think that now that Kathleen Kennedy is no longer going to be in charge of Lucasfilms, and even though I think Dave Filoni has a lot of room to negotiate and he will be able to use his vision, I do think that Disney higher ups are going to say, hey, we made you this guy. We put you in this position. So everything has to go through us. I think we see this land so different in 5 years. I think we are going to be looking at the resistance forest being the forest moon of Endor, and we're going to see the other section, the more deserty section, as being Tatooine, and that's going to be the cantina from Tatooine. I think this is coming down the road. And I think that one of the reasons that they got rid of Kathleen Kennedy or she resigned is that they weren't getting the traction out of Galaxy's Edge that they wanted.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting that, they announced that Disneyland's Galaxy's Edge is getting that, makeover. And it is going back to, reverse expanding to include the original trilogy and to have those characters. And I think that they're clearly trying to find the way to make Galaxy's Edge the big deal that it was originally, that it kind of fell off since then. Because it was a huge deal when it originally opened. And the lines were crazy just to get into the land, which was very exciting. But as time's gone by, you know, the appeal has, or I guess the urgency has waned, where people are like, well, I've kind of seen it. There's only so much you can do. It is a relatively small land, there's
Great
two
word.
rides.
Urgency. That's exactly what it is missing now.
Yes, so there's not a whole lot of pull to spend a lot of time there. Now, unless you're me and you love Oronto rap, because that alone is the reason to go to Galaxy's Edge. Those are so good. But they need to kind of pull that back in. And I think the one thing that they really missed, which obviously now they're trying to reverse course on, in Disneyland at least, was that nostalgia factor. They obviously were trying to pull in what Universal did with Harry Potter, but they made it this timeline in this series that people didn't have as much of an attachment to. The most crowded part of Galaxy's Edge is always the Millennium Falcon, because that's the iconic symbol that people recognize from the original Star Wars movies. They care about that. So I think bringing in more of those original characters is a great idea. Whose idea it was, we'll probably never find out. But I think it's smart. Before Galaxy's Edge was a thing, you used to have the Stormtrooper parades through Hollywood studios. And they'd pump that Imperial sweep, that Imperial March music, and you'd have the Stormtroopers coming through, and it was intimidating and it was fun. And then Galaxy's Edge opened and they have like two Stormtroopers like kind of walking around, which is fun, but it does lose a little of that intimidation factor. And I think if you can bring in, maybe we get another March of the Stormtroopers. Maybe Darth Vader is walking around threatening people. Maybe there's that element of nostalgia that they've been missing that can kind of hook onto that a little bit.
I don't think it's a coincidence that those announcements were made, I believe, the same week that
Yeah.
Kathleen Kennedy announced that she was going to be stepping down as the head of Lucasfilms. I think it's all part of how they're going to move forward in the future with this franchise and with this intellectual property. I want to say a couple things about Hollywood Studios and its particular version of Galaxy's Edge, because now that Launch Bay, Star Wars Launch Bay, has been closed, and that's going to be an animation area now. We no longer have the lineup meet and greets with BB-8 and Darth Vader and Chewbacca. So, especially that Darth Vader meet and greet is going to be sorely missing now. You're not going to have Darth Vader in Hollywood studios in any formal way. So that's a big deal. And I do think that that's going to lead to some changes. But I also want to say that last September, when my annual pass was going to expire because I moved, but I still had some months left on my annual pass. So I went back down the last couple days And Jillian and I, our friend Jillian, went to Hollywood Studios for a day, almost a whole day during that trip. We didn't step anywhere near Galaxy's Edge. And I hadn't been to Disney in probably about 6 months at the time. So I had gone a half of a year without being at Disney, without being at Galaxy's Edge. And when I was at Hollywood Studios, I wanted to see the new Villain show. I wanted to see the new Little Mermaid show. I wanted to eat at Hollywood Brown Derby. I didn't even think, you know what I have to do? I have to go back to Galaxy's Edge because I had done everything at Galaxy's Edge. And honestly, I had done everything at Galaxy's Edge by the time they opened Rise of the Resistance. It's not a very full land, and they do have to do something to keep people coming back, and it's got to evolve. And you know what? There wasn't music playing in the background of the Frontier either. Liberty Square. There wasn't just music playing in colonial Philadelphia. It just wasn't
What?
happening. So maybe it's okay to have a very, very well themed land. There's music at the Wizarding World of Harry Potter. You can do a well themed land and have music as well. So I definitely think that while a lot of these things aren't Kathleen Kennedy's fault, we can see how a big, strong personality like George Lucas, somebody who had ownership over, this was his baby, right? And maybe at some points too much control. But once they gave Kathleen Kennedy the wheel, she was almost put in a very difficult situation between a rock and a hard place because she might have had her own creative ideas, but it wasn't her baby. She didn't create Star Wars and she didn't own Star Wars. So she was caught in the middle, and I think she did the best with what she had available to her. And I'm a little worried, but maybe cautiously optimistic about how things will move forward in the future.
100%. 100%.
Well, if you're going to agree with me that much, that must mean that it is the perfect time to wrap up this episode. I don't get people agreeing with me that much most of the time. So, Maz, thank you so much for being here. This was an absolute blast of a conversation.
It was. Thank you so much.